The rain had turned the highway into a mirror, and Rosalind Harte was face down in it, tasting copper and motor oil, listening to the sound of her husband's taillights disappear into the dark. She didn't scream. There was no one to hear it. She lay on the shoulder of Route 90, 10 miles outside New Orleans, in the torn remains of a silk dress that had cost her 3 months of grocery money. The dress was champagne-colored. It had been constructed with care, structured to fit her full figure, built to hold her waist, celebrate her hips, make her feel, for one single evening, like she wasn't something Prescott Gaines kept apologizing for. He'd looked at it for 12 seconds before saying, "You look like a float in a parade." That was before the gala, before the auction, before the city's most celebrated architect introduced her to the mayor's wife as my assistant, and watched her go rigid, and then smiled the way men like him smile when they've drawn blood without lifting a hand. The drive home had been a quiet, suffocating thing, the kind of silence that has a shape, a pressure, like a hand around a throat. Rosalind had sat perfectly still in the passenger seat of his black Porsche and stared out the window and thought, "This is what the last 4 years have made of me, a woman who flinches at her own silence." "You couldn't even manage a conversation," Prescott had said finally. Low voice, controlled. The voice he used in boardrooms and at city council hearings, and whenever he wanted her to understand, she was a problem to be managed. "Janet Bourgeois asked you about the waterfront project, and you just stood there, like a piece of furniture. I wasn't sure what you'd want me to say," the old reflex, shrinking before the blow. "That's the problem, Rosalind. You never are." He'd turned to look at her, really look at her the way he used to when they first met, when she was his events coordinator, and he'd called her sharp and brilliant and said she had the kind of mind that saw things. Except now the look was a different animal entirely. You take up half the room just by standing in it and still manage to be invisible. "Do you understand how that makes me look?" She'd opened her mouth to answer. The back of his hand ended the conversation. Her head hit the passenger window, the car swerved, and before she fully understood what was happening, Prescott yanked the door open and said, "Get out," and when she didn't move fast enough, he shoved her, Harte, into the rain and the dark and the noise of the open highway. The Porsche was gone before she hit the ground. Now she lay on the wet asphalt and listened to the storm and thought about how no one in that ballroom had known. How they'd smiled at Prescott Gaines and called him visionary and shaken his hand while she stood 3 feet away holding a glass of champagne she never drank. Nobody had known, and she had let them not know, and now she was bleeding from her temple into a puddle of rainwater in the dark, and she was cold down to the marrow. The headlights came from the south, 3 of them spaced apart, moving in a deliberate formation that didn't look like ordinary traffic. They slowed, stopped. She heard doors open, heard the weight of footsteps on wet pavement, and she turned her head and tried to focus, but the light was too bright, and her vision was swimming at the edges. "There's someone on the shoulder," male voice, clipped, alert. Another voice closer, "She's bleeding, boss." The third voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It moved through the rain the way the rain couldn't, without resistance, without uncertainty, like it owned the frequency the storm occupied. "Don't touch her yet." Footsteps approached, unhurried. A shadow fell across her, blocking out the headlights, and Rosalind looked up. He was not what she expected the dark to produce. Tall in the way that reads as weight rather than height, broad-shouldered, built like something carved out of consequence. Dark jacket, a jaw sharp enough to cast its own shadow, eyes a deep, uncommon amber that she would have said were warm if the rest of his face hadn't looked like it had never been introduced to the concept. He crouched down, completely unbothered by the rain, soaking through the fabric of what was clearly an extraordinarily expensive suit. He looked at her face, not at her body, at her face, at the blood tracking from her temple, and the way she was holding herself perfectly still, like someone who had learned that stillness was protective. "Can you hear me?" he asked. Yes, her voice came out steadier than she expected. Where are you hurt? Head, maybe ribs, she paused, I'm not sure. Did a car hit you? She held his gaze. A man did. Something shifted in his expression. Not softened, sharpened. The distinction mattered. He stood and looked back at one of his men. Call Whitten. Tell him we're coming in. Then, without announcement, he shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her. The fabric was still warm from his body. It smelled like cedar and something darker underneath. Smoke or river air, or the particular scent of a man who makes decisions that can't be taken back. I'm going to carry you, he said. She almost laughed. She was not a small woman. She knew exactly how she looked lying there, 200 and some pounds of ruined silk and blood and rain. She knew the math of it. She had spent 4 years being taught the math of it. I'm too heavy, Rosalind said. The words came out automatically, pre-worn, like a coin pulled from a pocket she didn't remember putting it in. The man looked at her for a moment. Not with irritation, not with the careful, diplomatic blankness of someone pretending not to agree. He looked at her like the sentence didn't pass. Put your arm around my neck, he said. He lifted her like she weighed nothing. Not with visible effort. He didn't grunt, didn't shift his grip, didn't make the small unconscious sounds of a man recalculating. He simply rose, smooth and even, and held her against his chest with one arm under her knees and one behind her back, and walked toward the SUV. Rosalind Harte had not been held like that since before she understood what it felt like to apologize for existing. She didn't know what to do with it. So she closed her eyes and pressed her cheek against the warm solidity of his chest and listened to his heartbeat, slow, steady, completely untroubled, and let the dark take her. She woke in white. Not a hospital. The ceiling was wrong, too high, too ornate. The room smelled of fresh linen and an antiseptic, and faintly of old wood and river air. An IV line ran into the back of her left hand. Her ribs ached in a measured, managed way that meant medication. A man in a white coat sat in the corner. He looked up when she moved. Easy, he said. 2 cracked ribs, a moderate concussion. You've been out for nearly 30 hours. Rosalind blinked. Where am I? Somewhere safe. I'm Dr. Whitten. He stood, poured water from a silver pitcher, and brought it to her bedside. You were brought here by... The door opened. The man from the highway filled the frame. Dark shirt now, collar open, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked slightly less like a storm system in a suit, and slightly more like the eye of one. Dr. Whitten set the water down and left without being asked. The man crossed the room and sat in the chair the doctor had vacated. For a moment, he just looked at her. Not the way Prescott used to look, cataloguing flaws, measuring deficiencies. He looked at her the way someone studies a situation they're still assembling, with focus, with something that might have been respect. Rosalind Harte, he said, 31 years old, former event coordinator, current unpaid assistant to Prescott Gaines, who is your husband, who has a clean public record and a very dirty private one. She went still. You ran my name. I did. Who are you? Corbin Slate. He let the name sit in the air between them and watched to see if she knew it. She knew it. Everyone in Louisiana with any understanding of the city's actual architecture. Not the kind built in steel and glass, but the kind built in silence and debt and favors. Knew the name Corbin Slate. He ran the port. He ran the construction unions. He ran the quiet machinery underneath New Orleans that made everything above it possible, and he did it without ever appearing in a photograph that could be used against him. Why did you stop? She asked. Because you were there. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. And because I have a particular interest in your husband. Rosalind waited. Prescott Gaines has been laundering money through his development contracts for the past 3 years, Corbin said. His client is a Serbian organization called the Vukic Network. They're competitors of mine, which makes what Prescott does with their money my business. He paused. What I found interesting, Rosalind, is that your name appears on a significant number of the fraudulent contract approvals. You signed them." The blood left her face. "He told me they were vendor billing confirmations," she said. "For the events I coordinated, I signed hundreds of documents every quarter." "I know." "He used my signature." Her voice had gone very quiet. "If the fraud is ever traced—" "It reaches you first," Corbin said. "Your name, your signature. He has no digital connection to any of it. You're his insulation." She sat with that. 4 years. 4 years of being made to feel stupid, slow, invisible. And the whole time he'd been watching her sign her own ruin into existence. He hadn't been careless with her, he'd been careful with her. She had been a tool he was maintaining. "There's something else," Corbin said, and something in his tone made her look up. He set a document on the bed beside her. "My people found this when they ran his background more thoroughly this morning." An insurance policy, her name at the top. The coverage figure was $8.5 million. The policy had been finalized 7 months ago. The sole beneficiary was Prescott Gaines. Rosalind stared at it. Her hands were very steady, which surprised her. "He left me on the highway," she said. "A dark stretch of road, rain, no streetlights." She looked up. He was hoping a car would hit me. Corbin said nothing. He didn't need to. "He's been planning this, not a question. The policy is through an offshore underwriting firm, premiums paid in cash." Corbin's jaw was tight, the amber eyes gone dark. "There's a woman named Candace Soleil, junior architect at his firm, named in a separate trust document he drew up 4 months ago." Rosalind set the policy down carefully on the bed beside her. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at the man who had carried her out of the rain without asking for anything, who had handed her this information like he was handing her a weapon. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Prescott keeps physical records. He doesn't trust digital storage for anything that could put him in federal prison. He has a storage unit, 114, a facility on Chupitula Street, 6-digit access code." "The date we got married," Rosalind said immediately. "He uses it for everything. He thinks sentimentality is a kind of branding." A pause. "He's not sentimental. He just knows what codes stick." Corbin watched her, not with surprise, with something closer to confirmation. "I need those records," he said. "They'll expose the Vukic connection, unravel everything. Prescott, the network, and clear your name in the process." He leaned back. "In exchange, every fraudulent document bearing your signature gets attributed correctly. You walk away clean." Rosalind looked at him for a long moment. "And him?" she asked. "That," Corbin said quietly, "I'll let you decide." She healed at his compound for 2 weeks, in a house that sat behind iron gates and old live oaks draped in Spanish moss, the air always thick with river and coffee and the smell of things that had survived a very long time. She ate real meals without anyone watching her plate. She slept without listening for footsteps. She read in Corbin's library, and no one told her she was in the way. Corbin came to her most evenings. They worked, Prescott's financial records spread across a mahogany table, Rosalind tracing the web of shell companies and vendor names, while Corbin's man Adair typed without looking up. He always scheduled the Vukic transfers for the 1st of the month, Rosalind said one evening, tracing a column of dates with her finger. "He'd have me book a lunch meeting downtown as a cover. I thought it was city planning." She paused. "I coordinated his alibi for 3 years without knowing it." "You didn't know," Corbin said. "I should have." He was careful. "He thought I was stupid." She looked up. Corbin was watching her with that amber gaze that never seemed to be measuring her the way other eyes did, never counting, never calculating, never finding her wanting. He thought I was soft, not sharp enough to catch what he was doing. She turned back to the records. He was wrong. Corbin's mouth curved just slightly. "Yes," he said, "he was." The night before they moved on the storage unit, Rosalind stood before the mirror in her room. A stylist, someone Corbin had summoned without ceremony, had spent the afternoon with her. The result was a deep burgundy wrap dress in Italian crepe, fitted through the bodice, flowing over her hips, the fabric moving when she moved like it understood her body rather than accommodating it against its will. She looked at herself, her arms full and bare, her waist cinched and real, the soft weight of her stomach beneath the fabric. Prescott had spent 4 years teaching her to see all of it as failure, as evidence of something broken, something unworthy. She had learned the lesson so completely she carried it like scripture. Standing in that mirror, in that room, Rosalind unlearned it. She wasn't broken. She was exactly what she had always been, which was more than Prescott Gaines had ever deserved to be in the same room with. The door opened behind her. Corbin stood in the frame, dressed in a black suit that fit him with the precision of armor. He stopped. He looked at her the way a storm looks at open water, absolute, focused, without apology. "Ready?" he asked. His voice had dropped half a register. "Yes," Rosalind said, and she meant it in a way that reached further back than this moment. Unit 114 on Chupitula smelled of old paper and gun oil. Rosalind entered alone, 2 of Corbin's men stationed outside in civilian clothes. Her hands were steady on the keypad. The code clicked open on the first try. Inside, 4 black binders, 3 sealed envelopes, a laptop, and a small fireproof case. She opened the first binder and knew within 60 seconds that it was everything. Wire transfers. Handwritten ledgers in Prescott's meticulous architectural script. Photographs of meetings with men whose faces Adair had already flagged as Vukic associates. A complete paper trail. The kind that only exists because the man who created it believed he would never be caught, because the woman whose name was on everything was too slow to understand what she'd signed. The fireproof case held the original insurance documentation and a photograph of Prescott and Candace Soleil on a sailboat, both of them laughing easily in the sun, dated 5 months ago, 2 months after he'd started paying the premiums. Rosalind put everything into the bag she'd brought and zipped it shut. She breathed once, carefully, around the ache in her healing ribs. Then she walked back out into the warm New Orleans night. Prescott Gaines stood at the pinnacle of everything he'd ever built. The Crescent Point presentation was the culmination of his largest project, a $180 million waterfront development that would reshape the city's southern shoreline. The event was held at the Sanger Theatre because Prescott understood spectacle, and tonight he wanted the cameras to find him in a beautiful room surrounded by the city's most powerful people, looking like a man who had earned every inch of it. The mayor was there, the governor's deputy, a dozen city council members, 100 investors, journalists, civic leaders. Somewhere near the back, tastefully positioned, was Candace Soleil, pretending to be a colleague. Prescott took the stage to sustained applause. He was handsome the way men with money and the time to curate themselves are handsome, carefully, expensively, persuasively. He spoke about the city, about vision, about legacy. He was 40 seconds into his remarks when the main entrance doors opened. The room didn't stop all at once. It stopped in a wave, back to front, a ripple of silence moving toward the stage as heads turned and conversations died. Rosalind Harte walked in. She wore a gown the color of deep water, midnight navy velvet that caught the stage lights and held them. It was built to accommodate and celebrate every inch of her, and she wore it the way she had learned in the past 2 weeks to wear the truth of herself, without apology, without adjustment, without looking for permission. Her hair was up, her shoulders were back. At her side, 1 half step behind and to her right, walked Corbin Slate, expressionless, dark-suited, radiating the particular calm of a man who has already decided how something ends. The applause from the stage had stopped. "Rosalind," Prescott's voice cracked on the second syllable. He had gone the color of old paper. "What are you doing here?" "Attending a public event," she said. Her voice carried without effort in the vaulted space. "I used to manage events like this for you. I know how the AV system works." She reached into her clutch, removed a small drive, and handed it to the technician near the media table. who looked between her and the stage and after a long moment plugged it in. The presentation screen behind Prescott flickered, then it filled. Not the waterfront renderings, wire transfers, ledger pages in Prescott's handwriting, photographs of Vukic Associates, the insurance policy, $8.5 million, her name at the top, his name as sole beneficiary, finalized 7 months ago. And the photograph from the sailboat, Prescott and Candace, laughing in open sunlight. The room erupted. Investors were on their phones before the third image appeared. Journalists were moving. The mayor's chief of staff was pulling the mayor toward a side exit. City council members looked at each other with the expressions of people calculating whether proximity was survivable. She's lying. Prescott's voice had stripped of its boardroom control. He came off the stage fast. She's been making accusations. She's unstable. Security, remove her. He crossed the floor in 12 strides and reached for her arm. He didn't make contact. Corbin moved the way a current moves, not violently but completely without friction. He was between Prescott and Rosalind in a single step, and his hand closed on Prescott's wrist with a grip that stopped the man's momentum as absolutely as a wall. "Don't," Corbin said quietly, just the one word. The room was quiet enough that it reached the back row. Prescott looked up at him, and for a moment the city's celebrated visionary, the man who had spent 4 years teaching his wife that she was too much and not enough simultaneously, saw something in the amber eyes of Corbin Slate that made him go completely still. "Rosalind." Corbin said her name without looking away from Prescott. "Let him go," she said. Corbin released the wrist. Prescott stumbled back half a step. Rosalind walked forward until she was standing directly in front of her husband, almost exactly his height in her heels, and she looked at him for a long moment, at the architecture of the man she had once believed loved her, at the crumbling facade of everything he'd built on her silence and her signature, and her willingness to make herself small. "You left me on the highway," she said. "Not for the room, for him. You hit me and you pushed me out of a moving car, and you drove away because you needed me to die before the policy paid out. You thought that the woman you'd spent 4 years making invisible couldn't possibly survive without you telling her who she was." Prescott said nothing. His jaw worked silently. "I want you to understand something," Rosalind continued. "I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because every document you told me to sign is now in the hands of the FBI, and the Vukic network received an inventory of exactly what was in that storage unit this morning." She paused. "I didn't come here to watch you get arrested, Prescott. I came here to let you watch yourself fall. Those are different things." From the side entrance, 4 federal agents moved into the room with the unhurried certainty of people who had been waiting for their cue. Rosalind turned her back on Prescott Gaines. She walked back to where Corbin stood. He offered his arm. She took it, her hand resting over the steady beat of his heart. Behind her, she heard the sharp, businesslike click of handcuffs. She didn't look back. They stood on the theater steps in the warm New Orleans night, the air thick with river and jasmine and the distant brass of a second line drifting up from somewhere deeper in the city. The sounds of the chaos inside were muffled now, official, procedural, no longer her problem. Corbin stood beside her and looked out at the lit street and said nothing for a while, which she had come to understand was its own kind of language with him. "What now?" she asked. "That's your question to answer," he said, "not mine." She looked at him. The amber eyes were on her, steady and full of something that had been present since the first night, since the highway, since he had lifted her, without making her feel like a burden, something she was still learning to trust the shape of. "I want to go back to doing what I was good at," she said. "Before him, I was good at seeing things, how events move, how money moves, where the gaps are." She paused. "I imagine someone in your position finds that kind of skill useful." Corbin's mouth curved, a real one this time, not the partial things she'd seen across the war table. "I imagine so," he said. Then we should talk about that." He held out his arm. She took it, and they walked down the steps into the warm dark of the city that had tried to swallow her whole. The city that was about to learn what it looked like, when a woman who had been told she was nothing came back as exactly herself, and found that was more than enough.